So in the summer of 2010, I was one of the interns for the Concordia Food Systems Working Group. Myself and a number of students were tasked with looking at alternatives, coming up with alternatives to the food and beverage system at Concordia towards a more sustainable food and beverage system. I looked specifically at a number of different universities in Canada, looked at best case practices. For example, the University of British Columbia has a wonderful farm on site. We looked at ways that we can incorporate urban agriculture into Concordia. There was quite a lot of overlap actually between the Concordia greenhouse and the Food Systems Working Group at that time. I was looking specifically into the nature of exclusivity contracts, finding that at a lot of universities in Canada, in fact, the majority of Canadian universities, the food and beverage system was almost entirely ruled by or falling under the purview of exclusivity contracts with major corporations like Pepsi or Nestle, Chartwells. So at Concordia, we had an exclusivity contract that was going to be expiring with Pepsi in 2010 and then Chartwells in 2015. So myself and Megan Benite McDonald at the end took all of the information that was compiled by students and we put it into a big visual table with photos and columns for each university, basically indicating what the nature of exclusivity contracts was in that university and listing a number of movements towards a sustainable food and beverage system, whether it was cooperative cafes or farm-to-university systems or any other initiatives or organizations. I specifically was also working on, as part of that internship, building a movement around the negotiation of a more sustainable food and beverage contract when the PepsiCo contract expired. So a large portion of the report that I compiled was my experiences as a student that summer, gaining access to information about how the university worked. I state at the beginning of my report, and I just read it for the first time in a couple of years. In some ways, it's really terrible, and in other ways, I think it's really important, or at least I hope. But I state at the beginning, this report is intended to inform students who are attempting to enact change on campus, so that they don't have to go through the same learning process that I did. Coming into the university and saying, okay, I want to change the food and beverage system. Who do I talk to? And going through Hospitality Concordia, finding out about the purview of the VP services, etc. So part of that report that I compiled is actually a chart that shows the structure of the university administration and in detail the VP services and which segments of that office pertain specifically to decisions or play a role in decisions pertaining to the food and beverage system. So I tried to identify key actors in the administration and also key stakeholders within the university, and to try and engage those stakeholders in the university, all the while recording and mapping out my efforts so that later on down the line, someone who wanted to do the same thing or other people who actually, I would not recommend doing the same thing. It was very time consumptive. The point of it was so that people wouldn't have to do the same thing, so that they could come in and say, okay, I know who signs this exclusivity contract. And it sounds like such a simple thing, but it's amazing how long it took me to find that out. And I like to think that I'm not a complete idiot. I wasn't just bumbling around asking the wrong people the wrong questions. I do feel like I was being actively prevented from accessing that information. And of course, the epitome of that process of obfuscation is the exclusivity contract itself, right? So the number of times that I was told, you need to invoke the Access to Information Act. And I am so happy that David Burnins did, and that we finally have some of that information. So that I would add to the stockpile of information that we gathered over that time that can really help students who are now students and professors and organizations and departments and other stakeholders, community members of the university that are trying to enact positive change.
As you might be aware, in 2015, there's a new RFP to bid on a beverage contract at Concordia taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to get your thoughts on that. So going forward, is there a way to have an RFP that has some kind of a positive outcome, or what are your thoughts or feelings towards that?
Well, as I've expressed, I do feel that the RFP process is important in terms of being able to concretely incorporate the criteria that were recommended by the Environmental Advisory Committee. That being said, I still have my doubts as to the efficacy of the RFP process in terms of fully incorporating the desires of the university community. And that's because at the end of the day, when you're dealing with the people that are signing this contract, the financial question is always the bottom line. Economic sustainability, or as Marc Gauthier phrased it to me at one point, he phrased it to me once as a matter of social sustainability, in that if the university doesn't sign an exclusivity contract, it's losing out on a massive amount of income and people could lose their jobs. I wonder if at the time he was maybe referring to himself and the fact that if he didn't get this contract through the door, he'd lose his job. But in any case, it really does speak to the fact that environmental and social concerns unfortunately don't necessarily override financial considerations in the context of university administrative decision making. So I do believe that there needs to be a democratic, transparent, open bidding process. But I also think that it could be multiple contracts. I don't see why it has to be an exclusivity contract. If we don't, if the university doesn't confine itself to financial considerations and to a dependency on corporations to meet its bottom line, which is inherently problematic in a number of ways, then we can start to think and envision alternatives for the future. But if at the end of the day it always comes down to a question of money, well then there's no way that any of these alternative producers or suppliers are going to be able to give as much money to the university as Coke or Pepsi or Nestle. So there has to be not just criteria, but a relative weighting of criteria. And one way to do that as well is to further institutionalize and entrench those values in other organizations and bodies within the university. So at the level of the Concordia Student Union, we saw that a referendum on a bottled water-free campus was a major turning point in the movement. That is what made the university say, okay, it's happening. It wouldn't have happened without that, right? So, you know, similarly, maybe we can have a referendum that says, we don't want an exclusivity contract. I mean, that would be one way to move forward. And to do that not just at the CSU level, but at the GSU level. You know, if the David O'Brien Center for Sustainable Enterprise came out and said, hey, there are other alternatives, you know. They're the experts in this stuff. I mean, I'm sure that someone in the JMSB could come up with a great concrete alternative to exclusivity contracts, could do a great cost-benefit analysis and figure out, you know, relative weighting. I mean, it's kind of an impossible task to measure environmental and social sustainability against dollars, because at the end of the day, I think those things are priceless, right? An ecologically sound and socially just world is priceless. We shouldn't have to compare that to how much money the university is going to get for only allowing Pepsi on campus. That shouldn't be a thing that we have to do, but that's a thing that we're tasked with doing. So, yeah, at the end of the day, I think I'm still rather ambivalent and equal parts optimistic and disheartened, and above all, really excited to see what people come up with, because I have ideas, but I'm just one person, and I know that there are so many awesome and better ideas that people are coming up with right now. And I've been away from the university for a number of years, but I can't wait to see how this next contract negotiation plays out, and to see how students and professors and Board of Governors representatives create space for this dialogue and create space, claim space more than create it, I think is what needs to happen in this university, and what I've seen happen in this university, to claim space for change.